In late October of 2020, the Pacific Ocean gave birth to one of the most powerful storms ever recorded, Typhoon Goni, known in the Philippines as Super Typhoon Rolly. This storm wasn't just strong, it was extraordinary. Goni started as a small tropical depression just south of Guam on October 26th. Within a day, it grew into a tropical storm and was given the name Goni by meteorologists. The name means swan in Korean, which is an interesting contrast to the destruction this storm would later bring. Over the next few days, Goni moved westward across the warm waters of the Philippine Sea. These warm waters acted like fuel, helping the storm gain incredible strength. By October 30th, Goni exploded in power, rapidly intensifying into a Category 5 super typhoon. That means it had sustained winds stronger than most hurricanes and typhoons that people are used to hearing about. At its peak, Goni had winds reaching almost 195 miles per hour, making it the strongest tropical cyclone ever recorded to hit land based on 1-minute sustained winds. Imagine winds so strong they could rip roofs off buildings, uproot trees, and toss cars around like toys. The storm's eye, the calm center, Morakat, was perfectly round and very small, something meteorologists call a pinhole eye. This often means the storm is at its absolute strongest. Goni maintained this intense power for more than a full day as it headed straight for the Philippines. On the evening of October 31st, it made landfall on Catanduanes, an island in the Bicol region of the country. It struck with full force, bringing catastrophic winds and torrential rains. What made this storm especially dangerous was not just the wind, but also the massive flooding it caused. As Goni barreled over the mountainous areas of the Philippines, heavy rains mixed with volcanic debris created deadly lahars, fast-moving flows of mud and volcanic ash, especially near Mayon Volcano, one of the country's most active volcanoes. These lahars swept through communities, damaging homes and blocking roads, making it hard for people to escape or receive help. Before the storm hit, the Philippine government and disaster agencies worked quickly to prepare. They issued warnings and started evacuations. Hundreds of thousands of people were moved to safer places. But the situation was complicated by the ongoing pandemic. Evacuation centers were already crowded with people seeking shelter from the virus, so managing both threats at once was a huge challenge. Despite the preparations, the typhoon caused widespread damage. Power lines went down, leaving many areas in darkness. Crops were destroyed, which affected the food supply. Roads and bridges were blocked by debris and flooding, isolating some communities. It was clear that this was one of the worst storms the Philippines had faced in recent memory. After Super Typhoon Rolly made landfall on Catanduanes Island, it didn't lose much strength as it moved across the Bicol region. Instead, the storm maintained its powerful winds and heavy rains as it swept across the provinces of Albay, Camarines Sur, and Sorsogon. The destruction followed everywhere the typhoon passed. Houses made of light materials were torn apart, and even concrete buildings suffered serious damage. Trees were snapped like twigs, and countless power poles were downed, leaving many towns without electricity for days. One of the hardest hit areas was the town of Tiwi in Albay. There, the strong winds peeled off roofs and caused flooding that reached knee-deep in some streets. Rescue workers faced dangerous conditions trying to reach people trapped by fallen trees and landslides. The storm's intense rain caused rivers to overflow quickly, washing away bridges and cutting off entire communities from emergency assistance. Schools, government offices, and businesses across the region were closed for several days as people focused on cleanup and recovery. The typhoon destroyed many boats and fishing equipment, which left coastal communities struggling because fishing is their main source of income. Many families lost everything they had, including their homes and belongings. Typhoon Rolly continued to move inland and weaken gradually, but its effects lasted long after the winds died down. Floodwaters lingered, and landslides blocked roads for weeks, making it difficult to bring food, water, and medicine to the worst affected areas. Power outages also slowed down relief efforts, and some places remained in the dark for more than a week. The Philippine government declared a state of calamity in the Bicol region to speed up aid and allow funds to be used for emergency repairs. Thousands of soldiers and volunteers were sent out to assist with rescue missions, distribute relief goods, and help clear debris. Despite these efforts, many people faced tough days ahead, with no electricity, damaged homes, and little access to clean water. In addition to physical destruction, the typhoon had a severe impact on the local economy. Farmers lost their crops just before harvest, and many workers could not get to their jobs. Markets closed and prices for basic goods rose sharply. For many families, the storm caused financial hardship that would take months or even years to recover from. Typhoon Goni's rapid arrival also exposed weaknesses in infrastructure. Flood control systems and drainage channels were overwhelmed by the heavy rain, causing unexpected flash floods. Some roads and bridges built years ago could not withstand the storm, highlighting the need for better planning and stronger construction in typhoon-prone areas. In the aftermath of Typhoon Goni, the focus shifted from immediate rescue to long-term recovery. Many affected communities faced a daunting challenge: rebuilding homes and restoring basic services. Local governments began assessing the damage in detail, finding that thousands of houses were either completely destroyed or severely damaged. Temporary shelters were set up, but overcrowding and lack of sanitation raised concerns about health risks. One of the biggest problems after the typhoon was access to clean drinking water. Wells and water systems were contaminated by floodwaters, increasing the risk of waterborne diseases like diarrhea and cholera. Health officials urged residents to boil water before use, and distributed water purification tablets where possible. Clinics and hospitals struggled to provide care as supplies ran low, and some facilities had also been damaged. Schools faced a major setback too. Many buildings lost roofs or suffered structural damage, forcing classes to be suspended for weeks. The Department of Education worked quickly to provide temporary learning spaces and materials, aiming to minimize disruption for thousands of students. Teachers and parents showed strong commitment, organizing lessons in community centers or under makeshift shelters. Agriculture, a vital part of the local economy, was heavily affected. Vast rice fields and plantations were flooded or destroyed just before harvest time. Farmers reported losing not only crops, but also seeds and tools needed for the next planting season. This destruction threatened food security in the region, pushing officials to plan support programs that included seeds distribution, financial aid, and farming training. Transportation infrastructure also needed urgent repairs. Landslides and fallen trees blocked key highways and rural roads, isolating remote villages. Repair crews worked tirelessly to clear debris and fix damaged bridges, but some routes remained impassable for weeks. This made it difficult to transport goods and slowed down economic activity. The electrical grid in many areas was badly damaged, power lines snapped and substations flooded, leaving thousands of households and businesses without electricity. Utility companies prioritized restoring power to hospitals, water facilities, and main towns first, but full restoration took more than a month in some places. The government and several aid organizations launched massive relief operations. Emergency food packs, blankets, and clothing were distributed to thousands of families. Psychosocial support teams were sent to help people cope with trauma and loss. Volunteers played a vital role, working alongside officials to reach even the most isolated communities. Typhoon Goni also prompted renewed discussions about climate change and disaster preparedness in the Philippines. Experts warned that stronger and more frequent storms could become the new normal due to global warming. Many called for greater investment in resilient infrastructure, early warning systems, and community education to reduce the impact of future disasters. As the weeks passed following Typhoon Goni, the long-term effects on the region's economy became clearer. Many small businesses, especially those dependent on tourism and agriculture, faced serious setbacks. Local markets were disrupted by the destruction of roads and power outages, reducing the flow of goods and income. Shop owners struggled to restock supplies, and many workers found themselves without jobs as businesses closed temporarily or permanently. In response, the national government launched several recovery programs aimed at jump-starting local economies. Low-interest loans and grants were made available to small business owners to help rebuild and restock. Training sessions were held to improve skills in disaster-resilient business practices, encouraging entrepreneurs to adapt to the new climate realities. One notable challenge was rebuilding schools and hospitals. Some schools had been completely flattened, requiring reconstruction from the ground up. Hospitals faced shortages of equipment and medicines, and some had to refer patients to better equipped facilities in nearby cities. International aid agencies stepped in to provide funds and technical assistance for rebuilding health and education infrastructure. The mental health impact of the typhoon also gained attention. Many survivors suffered from anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress due to the loss of loved ones, homes, and livelihoods. Local health workers began community outreach programs to provide counseling and support groups. Religious and community leaders played a key role in offering comfort and helping people find hope amid the devastation. Environmental damage was another serious concern. Floodwaters and strong winds destroyed forests, uprooted trees, and damaged coral reefs along the coast. This destruction affected biodiversity and weakened natural barriers that protect communities from future storms and flooding. Environmental organizations pushed for reforestation projects and coral reef restoration to help nature recover. Scientists and disaster experts started analyzing data from Typhoon Goni to improve forecasting models. Satellite images and weather station reports were used to understand how the storm developed and why it caused such severe damage in specific areas. These studies aimed to provide better early warnings and evacuation plans for future typhoons. Community resilience also became a major focus. Many towns began organizing neighborhood disaster response teams trained in first aid, evacuation procedures, and emergency communication. These teams helped reduce casualties and damage during Goni by acting quickly and efficiently. Schools and local governments held drills to prepare residents for the next storm season. Despite the hardships, stories of kindness and solidarity stood out. Neighbors shared food and shelter, volunteers traveled from distant provinces to help, and local leaders worked tirelessly to restore normal life. These acts of unity showed the strength of the Filipino spirit in the face of natural disasters. As the recovery efforts continued months after Typhoon Goni, communities began focusing on long-term solutions to reduce future risks. One important strategy was improving infrastructure to withstand stronger storms. Engineers designed stronger homes with reinforced walls and roofs, and new public buildings were built on higher ground to avoid flooding. Roads and bridges were reconstructed with better materials and designs that allowed water to flow through instead of causing blockages. Local governments also improved their disaster preparedness plans. Early warning systems were upgraded with modern technology, including sirens, text alerts, and community radios, to quickly inform residents of approaching storms. Evacuation centers were expanded and stocked with emergency supplies like food, water, blankets, and medicines to support displaced families. In schools, disaster education became part of the curriculum. Children learned about typhoon safety, first aid, and how to respond during emergencies. This helped build a culture of awareness and readiness among the younger generation, empowering them to protect themselves and their families. Farmers began experimenting with more resilient crops and farming methods. Some switched to rice varieties that tolerate floods, while others built raised beds to protect plants from water damage. These changes aimed to secure food production despite unpredictable weather patterns caused by climate change. The government also worked on environmental restoration projects to reduce the impact of future storms. Mangrove forests, which act as natural barriers against waves and storm surges, were replanted along vulnerable coastlines. Wetlands were preserved and restored to absorb excess rainwater and reduce flooding in nearby towns. International organizations continued to provide support for rebuilding and development. Through partnerships, the affected regions gained access to better technology, training, and financial resources. These collaborations helped build more resilient communities that could better handle future disasters. In reflecting on Typhoon Goni, experts emphasized the importance of learning from each storm to improve responses and save lives. While the destruction was severe, it highlighted weaknesses that could be addressed before the next disaster. The lessons from Goni shaped policies and preparedness efforts not only in the Philippines but also in other typhoon-prone countries. Ultimately, the spirit of resilience, cooperation, and hope defined the recovery. Despite the losses, people came together to rebuild stronger, better prepared, and more united. This enduring determination serves as a reminder that while nature's power is immense, human courage and kindness are just as powerful. In early August of the year 2009, something started brewing quietly over the warm waters of the Western Pacific. Didn't seem like much at first, just a tropical depression forming far out to sea, roughly 1,000 kilometers east of Luzon in the Philippines. But that small storm was the beginning of what would become Typhoon Morakat, a disaster that would go down as the wettest and deadliest typhoon in Taiwan's recorded history. At first, it struggled to stay organized. Meteorologists even downgraded it briefly, thinking it might not develop further. But nature had other plans. Later that same day, the system pulled itself together again. It strengthened slowly but steadily, and by August 3rd, the Japan Meteorological Agency had given it a name, Morakat. In the Philippines, they called it Typhoon Kiko. As the storm moved west, it picked up strength. By August 5th, Morakat had reached typhoon status. The winds had grown stronger, with the Joint Typhoon Warning Center recording sustained 1-minute winds of about 150 kilometers per hour. The storm wasn't massive in terms of wind, but what it lacked in brute force, it made up for in size and moisture. This typhoon wasn't just strong, it was slow. That slow movement would be key to the destruction it would later cause. Around this time, countries in its path began issuing warnings. In Japan, gale alerts were sent out across regions like Moji, Yokohama, and Naha. On Okinawa, U.S. military bases raised their tropical cyclone readiness level, preparing for strong winds. In the Philippines, authorities warned residents in northern Luzon and nearby islands that the storm could bring heavy rain, not necessarily from direct impact, but by enhancing the southwest monsoon. As expected, that monsoon would later lead to deadly flooding in parts of the country, killing over 24 people. But Taiwan was about to face the worst of it. On August 5th, the Central Weather Bureau there issued a sea typhoon alert. Just 2 days later, Morakat reached its peak strength with a pressure of 945 millibars and wind speeds that matched a Category 1 hurricane. Then it started creeping toward the island, very slowly. That's when the real trouble began. On the morning of August 7th, 2009, Typhoon Morakat made landfall in Taiwan. Although it had weakened from its peak intensity, the storm brought with it an overwhelming force of wind and rain. The winds were strong enough to uproot trees and damage rooftops, but it was the rain that would leave the most lasting impact. As the typhoon stalled over the island, it unleashed an unprecedented amount of rainfall. Some areas recorded over 100 inches within a span of just 3 days. The steep mountains of southern and central Taiwan, already vulnerable to landslides, quickly became saturated. Hillsides gave way, sending waves of mud and debris crashing into everything in their path. Entire villages were cut off as roads were buried and bridges were swept away by rising rivers. Rivers overflowed their banks, submerging streets and homes under muddy water. In the city of Tainan and the surrounding regions, families were forced to evacuate quickly as floodwaters rose faster than anyone expected. The nonstop rain overwhelmed drainage systems, triggered flash floods, and isolated dozens of towns. Military personnel were deployed to assist, but many areas were unreachable. Helicopters flew through heavy rain to drop supplies as thousands of people were left without shelter, food, or clean water. While Typhoon Morakat continued to drift slowly away from Taiwan, the destruction it caused was only beginning to reveal itself. One of the most devastating consequences of Typhoon Morakat unfolded in a remote area of southern Taiwan. On the morning of August 8th, just 1 day after the typhoon made landfall, the village of Xiaolin in Kaohsiung County faced a disaster unlike anything in recent memory. After more than 48 hours of intense rainfall, the mountains above the village could no longer hold. A massive landslide was triggered, described by witnesses as a roaring wall of earth and rock that descended without warning. Within moments, nearly the entire village was buried. Hundreds of homes were completely destroyed, and many residents had no time to escape. Only a small number of villagers managed to survive by fleeing to higher ground or clinging to the edges of the landslide zone. Rescue crews were delayed due to washed-out roads and unstable terrain, and helicopters were the only way to reach the area. When rescuers finally arrived, they were met with a scene of total destruction. Rooftops barely visible above the mud, and entire families missing. Search efforts continued for days, but the scale of the landslide made recovery nearly impossible. The soil was unstable, and heavy machinery could not reach the site without risking further collapse. By the end of the operation, it was estimated that over 400 people had lost their lives in Xiaolin alone. The tragedy became a symbol of the typhoon's deadly impact. For many across Taiwan, it marked a painful turning point, revealing how a single storm could change the course of countless lives in an instant. While the tragedy in Xiaolin village captured global attention, Typhoon Morakat's devastation extended far beyond a single location. Across Taiwan, countless communities faced widespread destruction. Roads were torn apart by rushing floodwaters, over 1,000 bridges were damaged or washed away, and vital transportation routes were rendered impassable. In the mountainous regions, dozens of smaller villages became isolated, cut off from help for several days. Agricultural regions in southern Taiwan suffered tremendous losses. Farmland was submerged for days, wiping out rice, banana, and vegetable crops that families depended on for both income and survival. Livestock drowned in flooded pens, and storage facilities filled with mud and debris. Farmers described the destruction as a complete reset of their livelihoods, with years of work undone in mere hours. Hospitals and emergency shelters quickly reached capacity. Over 20,000 people were forced to evacuate and spent weeks in temporary shelters, set up in schools, stadiums, and military camps. These facilities were crowded and under-resourced, making it difficult for authorities to provide basic supplies such as food, water, and medicine. The scale of the disaster drew international attention. Countries including the United States, Japan, and South Korea offered financial assistance and sent rescue teams to support Taiwan's overwhelmed emergency services. Charitable organizations and NGOs also stepped in, distributing supplies and helping displaced families find temporary housing. In response to the growing crisis, Taiwan's government faced mounting pressure to act quickly. Military helicopters were dispatched to deliver aid and airlift the injured. Engineers worked around the clock to rebuild access roads and restore power and communication lines. Despite these efforts, many citizens criticized the government's initial response as too slow, especially in the first critical days after the storm. The aftermath of Typhoon Morakat became not only a humanitarian crisis, but also a national reckoning, forcing Taiwan to confront the weaknesses in its disaster response system and infrastructure planning. In the weeks and months after Typhoon Morakat left Taiwan, the country began the long and painful road to recovery. Entire communities had to be relocated, especially in mountainous regions where the land was no longer stable. More than 40 villages were declared unsafe to live in, and thousands of survivors were moved to newly constructed housing sites built by the government and aid groups. While these new homes offered safety, many families struggled with the emotional toll of being separated from ancestral land and lifelong neighbors. The emotional scars of the disaster ran deep. Families who had lost loved ones or whose homes were swept away had to cope with trauma and grief while rebuilding their lives from the ground up. Schools reopened, but some classrooms had empty seats that would never be filled again. Survivors organized memorial events to honor the dead, especially those lost in Jiaolin village. These gatherings became a space for both mourning and community healing. Government officials soon launched a full investigation into how the disaster had unfolded. Studies revealed that poor land use policies, unregulated construction in vulnerable areas, and outdated flood management systems had made the damage far worse than it needed to be. In response, Taiwan introduced major changes in its disaster prevention planning. New laws were passed to ban construction in high-risk areas, and investment in early warning systems was significantly increased. Internationally, Typhoon Morakat also served as a warning. It became a case study in how slow-moving tropical storms can be just as dangerous as fast, powerful typhoons. Meteorologists and emergency planners around the world began rethinking how to measure storm threats, focusing more on rainfall and flood risk, rather than just wind speed. By the one-year anniversary of the storm, Taiwan had made major progress in rebuilding, but the impact of Typhoon Morakat continued to shape the nation's approach to disaster resilience. It was no longer just about reacting to storms, it was about preparing for them with better science, better infrastructure, and stronger community support. Typhoon Morakat did not just leave behind destruction or nisraut. It changed how a country understood nature's power and how human decisions could either lessen or worsen that impact. The storm remains one of the most important reminders in Taiwan's modern history that resilience is not only about rebuilding, but about learning, adapting, and never forgetting what was lost. In the autumn of 1979, meteorologists monitoring the Pacific Ocean began to notice the early signs of what would become one of the most powerful tropical cyclones in recorded history. It all started with a tropical disturbance near the Marshall Islands. At first, it seemed unremarkable, a cluster of thunderstorms brewing in warm ocean waters. But as the system began to organize, meteorologists could see it was no ordinary storm. The warm waters of the Pacific Ocean, combined with favorable atmospheric conditions, provided the perfect environment for the disturbance to develop. Sea surface temperatures in the region were unusually high, exceeding 80 degrees Fahrenheit, creating a vast reservoir of energy. At the same time, low wind shear, a condition where winds at different altitudes are not drastically different in speed or direction, allowed the storm to maintain its structure and grow rapidly. As the storm gathered strength, the Japan Meteorological Agency officially classified it as a tropical depression on October 8, 1979. By October 9th, it had intensified into a tropical storm, earning the name Tip. Over the next few days, Tip's growth was extraordinary. It transformed from a modest tropical storm into a full-fledged typhoon, its spiraling bands of clouds stretching farther and farther across the ocean. By October 11th, Tip reached the status of a super typhoon. At its peak, the storm boasted winds of over 190 miles per hour and a minimum central pressure of 870 millibars, the lowest ever recorded for a tropical cyclone. These figures alone make Typhoon Tip a meteorological marvel, but the storm's size was equally astonishing. At its largest, Tip's circulation spanned over 1,380 miles in diameter, making it the widest tropical cyclone ever documented. The immense size and power of Tip were not just theoretical measurements, they represented a serious threat to anyone in its path. Meteorologists faced the daunting challenge of predicting where the storm would go and how intense it would become. In an era without modern satellite imagery or advanced computer modeling, this task was as much an art as it was a science. Using weather balloons, aircraft reconnaissance, and early satellite data, they worked tirelessly to track Tip's progress. By mid-October, Tip had become a storm that defied imagination. Its enormous eye, a calm, eerily clear area at the center of the storm, measured over 20 miles across, surrounded by towering walls of clouds where the most violent winds and heaviest rains churned. This was the calm before the chaos, as the typhoon approached areas where its impact would be felt most acutely. Communities across the Western Pacific scrambled to prepare. In Japan and nearby islands like Guam, authorities issued evacuation orders, closed schools and businesses, and braced for the storm's arrival. People boarded up windows, secured their belongings, and sought refuge in designated shelters. Despite the best efforts of forecasters and officials, the sheer scale of Tip's power made it impossible to predict the exact extent of the destruction that lay ahead. Part 1 of this journey into Typhoon Tip's history ends here, with the storm at its peak intensity and a sense of unease hanging heavy over the Pacific. The next part will delve deeper into Tip's path and the impact of this colossal storm on the people and places in its way. As Typhoon Tip reached its peak intensity in mid-October of 1979, its immense size and power set it apart from any storm in recorded history. With its towering clouds, vast wind field, and record-breaking low pressure, Tip became a force of nature that demanded respect and fear. The storm's trajectory was closely monitored as forecasters worked tirelessly to predict its path and issue timely warnings to the regions at risk. Tip began its journey westward across the Pacific, its spiraling arms stretching out over 1,380 miles. The storm churned through open waters, gathering moisture and energy from the warm ocean surface. While the storm's eye remained a quiet center of calm, the surrounding eye wall was a region of unrelenting chaos. Wind speeds soared to over 190 miles per hour, accompanied by torrential rains that poured down in sheets, obscuring visibility and creating treacherous conditions for ships at sea. As the storm moved closer to land, the Japanese island of Guam found itself in Tip's vast outer reach. Although the island was spared a direct hit, it still faced strong winds, heavy rains, and rising seas. Coastal areas were inundated by storm surges, forcing evacuations and leaving residents grappling with power outages and flooded homes. Fishermen scrambled to secure their boats, and emergency responders worked around the clock to protect lives and property. While Guam experienced only a glancing blow, Japan's southern islands braced for the storm's full impact. Typhoon Tip shifted slightly northeast, sparing the most populated regions a direct hit, but still unleashing its fury on the Ryukyu Islands. Strong winds tore through towns, toppling trees and power lines, while torrential rains caused landslides that buried roads and threatened entire villages. At the same time, the storm's massive circulation caused ripple effects far beyond its immediate path. In the Philippines, hundreds of miles away, heavy rains brought by Tip's outer bands triggered flash floods and displaced thousands of families. The storm's sheer size meant that even areas not directly in its path felt its influence, underscoring the far-reaching impact of such a powerful system. Tip's eventual landfall came on October 19, 1979, in Japan's Shikoku region. By this point, the storm had weakened slightly from its record-setting peak, but it remained a formidable typhoon, with winds exceeding 120 miles per hour. Coastal towns bore the brunt of the storm surge, which swallowed entire stretches of shoreline, destroying homes and businesses in its wake. Farther inland, rivers swelled beyond their banks, inundating fields and towns and forcing thousands of residents to flee to higher ground. Throughout the chaos, stories of survival and resilience emerged. Families huddled together in shelters, clinging to hope as the storm raged outside. Emergency services worked tirelessly to rescue stranded residents, wading through floodwaters and navigating debris-strewn streets. The storm's impact on infrastructure was severe, with countless buildings reduced to rubble, roads rendered impassable, and communication networks disrupted. As Tip moved inland and began to lose strength, it left behind a trail of destruction that stretched for hundreds of miles. In the storm's wake, survivors emerged to assess the damage and begin the long process of recovery. Yet even as the winds died down and the rain subsided, the true scale of the disaster was only beginning to become clear. Next, we will explore the aftermath of Typhoon Tip, delving into the human toll, the challenges faced by those left in its path, and the lessons learned from this unprecedented storm. When Typhoon Tip finally dissipated in late October of 1979, the devastation left behind was staggering. Entire communities were unrecognizable, transformed by the relentless winds, rain, and storm surges that had accompanied the storm's passage. For the people who had endured its wrath, the aftermath was a time of reckoning, survival, and rebuilding. In Japan, the storm's impacts were most severe in the Shikoku and Honshu regions. Entire neighborhoods had been submerged by flooding, with homes and businesses reduced to soggy ruins. Farmlands, which were the lifeblood for many communities, were devastated as rivers overflowed, carrying away crops and livestock. Coastal towns suffered extensive damage, with fishing fleets destroyed and ports rendered unusable. One of the most immediate concerns was the displacement of thousands of residents. Shelters quickly filled with families seeking refuge, many of whom had lost everything. In the days following the storm, emergency response teams worked tirelessly to deliver food, clean water, and medical aid to the affected areas. However, the sheer scale of the disaster made it a daunting task. Roads were blocked by landslides and debris, making it difficult for supplies to reach remote locations. The human toll of the storm was deeply felt. Dozens of lives were lost, and many more were injured. Hospitals were overwhelmed with patients suffering from storm-related injuries, and there was a growing concern about the spread of waterborne diseases due to the contaminated floodwaters. Volunteers and aid organizations rallied to support those in need, but the emotional scars of the disaster were evident in every survivor's story. Beyond the immediate challenges, the long-term effects of Tip were profound. Infrastructure across the region was severely damaged, with roads, bridges, and power lines needing extensive repairs. In some areas, it took weeks or even months to restore electricity and clean water. Schools and public buildings that had been used as evacuation centers required significant renovations before they could reopen. Environmental damage was another pressing issue. Forests along the typhoon's path were left in shambles, with uprooted trees scattered like matchsticks. Coastal erosion altered the landscape, and the storm's intense rainfall led to soil destabilization, increasing the risk of future landslides. Efforts to clean up and repair the damage required coordination between local governments, national agencies, and international aid organizations. As the recovery unfolded, stories of resilience and solidarity emerged. Communities banded together to clear debris, rebuild homes, and support one another through the hardships. Local leaders organized fundraisers and donation drives, while neighboring regions sent resources and manpower to assist in the recovery efforts. Despite the immense challenges, there was a collective determination to overcome the disaster and restore a sense of normalcy. In the months that followed, meteorologists and scientists analyzed Typhoon Tip's unprecedented strength and impact. Its record-breaking size and intensity highlighted the need for improved forecasting technology and disaster preparedness. Governments across the Pacific region began reassessing their emergency response strategies, seeking to learn from Tip's devastating lessons to better protect their citizens in the future. As we wrap up, we will reflect on the legacy of Typhoon Tip, examining how it changed our understanding of tropical cyclones and the ongoing quest to predict and mitigate such powerful forces of nature. Typhoon Tip's story did not end when its winds subsided or the floodwaters receded. Instead, the storm left an enduring legacy, one that reshaped our understanding of tropical cyclones and the ways we prepare for natural disasters. In the decades since Tip's unprecedented arrival in 1979, its lessons have influenced meteorology, disaster management, and public awareness in profound ways. One of the most significant impacts of Typhoon Tip was its contribution to meteorological science. At the time, the storm's size and intensity were unparalleled, pushing scientists to study its unique characteristics. Researchers examined how Tip's interaction with warm ocean waters and atmospheric conditions created the perfect environment for such a colossal storm to form. This research not only deepened our understanding of typhoon dynamics, but also helped improve predictive models, enabling forecasters to anticipate storm behavior with greater accuracy. Tip also highlighted the importance of advancements in storm monitoring technology. In the late 1970s, satellite imagery was still in its early stages, and weather data collection relied heavily on reconnaissance aircraft and surface observations. The challenges of tracking Tip underscored the need for more robust satellite systems, which have since become essential tools in monitoring tropical cyclones worldwide. Today, meteorologists can track storms in real time, providing earlier warnings and saving countless lives. On a societal level, Tip served as a wake-up call for disaster preparedness. Communities and governments across the Pacific Basin recognize the critical importance of early warning systems, evacuation protocols, and infrastructure resilience. In Japan, where the storm's impact was most severe, efforts were made to strengthen coastal defenses, improve flood management systems, and educate the public on how to respond to typhoons. These measures have undoubtedly reduced the toll of subsequent storms in the region. The human stories of Typhoon Tip, of loss, resilience, and recovery, also played a pivotal role in fostering a deeper appreciation for the power of nature. Survivors' accounts of the storm's fury and its aftermath served as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of coastal communities. These narratives helped galvanize support for stronger disaster response programs and greater investment in community preparedness. Globally, Tip's record-breaking intensity became a benchmark in the study of tropical cyclones. The storm's name remains synonymous with extreme weather, and its place in history has influenced how we perceive and respond to similar events. It also spurred international collaboration among scientists, governments, and organizations working together to mitigate the impacts of future storms. While Typhoon Tip was a natural disaster of immense destruction, its legacy is also one of progress and resilience. The storm's unprecedented power challenged humanity to rise to the occasion, to learn from the devastation, and to build a future where we are better equipped to face the forces of nature. The advancements in meteorology, disaster management, and community preparedness that followed in Tip's wake stand as a testament to our ability to adapt and endure. As we reflect on the history of Typhoon Tip, we are reminded of the duality of nature's beauty and its potential for destruction. It is a call to action to respect the environment, prepare for the unpredictable, and remain steadfast in the face of adversity. Typhoon Tip may have been a storm of the past, but its lessons are timeless, serving as a guide for navigating the storms of the future. In the days leading up to the deadly typhoon that struck Hong Kong in the early morning hours of Tuesday, September 18th of the year 1906, there was no real sign of the devastation that was about to unfold. Life in the city was moving along like usual. Hong Kong at the time was a growing British colony and a busy international port. Streets were filled with people going about their day, shopkeepers opening stores, boats crowding the harbor, trams running through the heart of the city, and locals navigating their daily routines. There had been storms before, of course. Typhoons weren't new to the region, but this one would end up being one of the deadliest natural disasters in the city's history. The warning signs were subtle at first. The barometer began to drop steadily on the morning of the storm. Between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock that morning, the pressure fell from 29.74 to 29.28 inches of mercury. This might not mean much to the average person, but to those watching the skies, like the Hong Kong Observatory, it was clear that something serious was developing. Still, there wasn't much time. At 8:40 in the morning, a black drum was raised by the observatory, which was the official warning signal at the time for tropical cyclones. But this was barely 30 minutes before the full force of the typhoon hit. Unfortunately, this short notice left almost no time for preparations. By 9 o'clock, ferries had stopped operating, but it was already too late for many. Foreign steamer captains and their crews, stranded on land, had no time to reach their vessels and secure them. Some people didn't even realize the danger until it was upon them. That's how fast it moved. Despite some warnings being telegraphed days earlier from Japan and Shanghai, it wasn't until the morning of the 18th that most people in Hong Kong knew anything was wrong. It caught nearly everyone off guard. The typhoon itself had formed several days earlier, around Saturday, September 15th, near the Bashi Channel to the southeast of Hong Kong. It was first spotted by Japanese meteorologists east of Formosa, which is modern-day Taiwan. Ships passing through the Pacific Ocean also recorded changes in wind and pressure. But back in Hong Kong, where communication systems were limited and weather tracking was still a developing science, the urgency of those early warnings didn't make their way to the people in time. By the time the typhoon approached Hong Kong, it had grown into a powerful storm with winds swirling around a massive core. The eye of the storm was recorded just 30 nautical miles away, with wind speeds reaching 24 miles per hour as it neared the city. While that might not sound extremely fast, what made this storm deadly was its sheer size and intensity. The wind force extended across an area about 100 miles in diameter. The winds were violent, but the real damage came from what followed: the rising water, the massive waves, and the terrifying storm surge. As people in the city began to realize that this was no ordinary storm, panic set in. Boats were rushed to shelter if they could make it, markets shut down. People ran for cover, trying to find solid ground or shelter indoors. The skies grew darker and the air grew heavier. For many, it was already too late to escape what was coming, and still no one could have predicted how bad things would get. The typhoon was just beginning its path of destruction, and within hours, it would change the city forever. As the sun rose over Hong Kong on the morning of Tuesday, September 18th, the air was thick and unusually still. Most residents were completely unaware that a massive storm was racing toward the city. At around 8:40 in the morning, the Royal Observatory hoisted the black drum signal, a warning system used since the year 1884 to alert of approaching tropical cyclones. Just minutes later, the typhoon gun was fired at the harbor, sounding the alarm that danger was imminent. But by that point, it was already too late for many. The typhoon had moved in fast. In just 2 hours, barometer readings dropped rapidly, from 29.74 to 29.28 inches of mercury. That kind of drop signaled a sudden and extreme pressure change, a sure sign of the approaching storm's intensity. By 9 in the morning, ferry services had already come to a halt, and people were stranded all across the harbor. Many foreign steamer crews couldn't reach their vessels in time to prepare, leaving countless ships vulnerable as the storm swept in. The winds picked up with terrifying speed. The Hong Kong Observatory measured a velocity of 24 miles per hour when the eye of the storm was still 30 nautical miles away. That might not sound fast at first, but with a storm of this scale, those winds carried an unstoppable force. In a matter of minutes, the sea became a boiling mess of churning waves and crashing surf. Tidal waves slammed against the shoreline, flooding entire coastal areas before anyone had time to react. Along the waterfront, the rising water broke down sea walls, carried away small boats, and smashed wooden piers to splinters. The typhoon's full power became tragically clear as it hit during high tide. Thousands of people living in vulnerable coastal areas were directly in its path. For many Chinese families living on houseboats, some of the nearly 5,000 registered watercraft in the city, there was no escape. The storm struck so quickly that few could make it to shore. Along the stretch from West Point to Causeway Bay, sampans and lighters were tossed into one another like toys. Entire communities living on the water disappeared in an instant. By mid-morning, buildings on land were also being torn apart. Roof tiles and glass rained down into the streets. Electric tram lines on Hong Kong Island came to a stop when wiring systems were ripped apart. The Peak tram was also forced to shut down after damage to its signal cables and nearby tracks. On Bowen Road, fallen trees and debris made entire routes impassable. At the botanical gardens, many trees were destroyed, although the zoological section somehow made it through untouched. The storm showed no mercy. At West Point, major warehouses, including those owned by Jardine, Matheson, and Jebson and Company, lost their roofs and had their walls ripped away. Piers collapsed across the Central District, including the Star Ferry Wharf, Blake Pier, and Queen's Statue Wharf. Even newly constructed landmarks like the General Post Office and the Supreme Court site were heavily damaged, their bamboo scaffolding torn down and scattered across nearby roads. This typhoon didn't just damage a few structures. It overwhelmed every part of life in Hong Kong, from transportation and housing to public safety and communication. And all of it happened in just a few short hours, leaving the city in shock and on its knees. But as devastating as this was, the true scale of the disaster would only become clear as people began searching for loved ones in the wreckage. Next, we'll look at the tragedy that unfolded in the harbor, with ships sunk, hundreds of lives lost, and heroic rescues carried out in the middle of the storm. As the typhoon continued its assault on Hong Kong, the waters of Victoria Harbor turned into a deadly trap. The chaos reached its peak between 10 in the morning and noon, when winds blew with hurricane force and the sea surged over the seawalls. The harbor, normally a place of trade and activity, became unrecognizable. Massive waves rose up without warning, some said to be over 30 feet high, crashing down on vessels of all sizes. More than 200 ships and boats were damaged or sunk. Among them were ferries, cargo steamers, and fishing junks. The Chung Shan, a large steamer, was thrown from its mooring and slammed into the dockside before capsizing. The Yunnan, another vessel anchored near Kowloon, broke free and collided with smaller boats before vanishing beneath the waves. The Japanese freighter Asama Maru, caught in the path of the storm while attempting to leave port, lost control and drifted until it struck a pier. Its hull was badly damaged, but it managed to remain afloat. Countless smaller boats were not so fortunate. Entire fleets of sampans, which served as both homes and workplaces for many families, were shattered by debris or dashed against sea walls. Witnesses later described seeing people clinging to pieces of wreckage or trying to swim through oil-coated water, screaming for help as strong currents pulled them under. The sounds of splintering wood and cries for rescue echoed through the harbor. Rescue efforts began while the storm still raged. British Navy personnel from the HMS Tamar risked their lives by launching lifeboats into the rough water, pulling dozens of people to safety. Police and fire crews also worked to save those trapped on the docks and in partially sunken ships. Some managed to haul survivors up by ropes and ladders, even as the wind threatened to blow them into the sea themselves. Others could only watch helplessly as overturned boats floated past with no signs of life on board. One of the most heartbreaking scenes unfolded near Aberdeen, on the southern side of Hong Kong Island. A fleet of fishing boats had tried to take shelter in the narrow inlet there, but the wind shifted suddenly and a massive wave surged into the harbor mouth. Within minutes, more than 40 boats were overturned or crushed together. Entire families were lost, including children and elderly relatives who had been asleep below deck when the storm hit. As the winds finally began to weaken around midday, the damage was already staggering. Oil from damaged freighters spread across the water, mixing with floating debris, splintered wood, and unclaimed belongings. The sea, once the heart of Hong Kong's lifeline, had become a floating graveyard. The worst was not yet over, though. Survivors began emerging from shelters, only to find their homes destroyed and loved ones missing. With communication lines down and roads blocked, news of the disaster spread slowly. It would take several more days before the full human cost became known. As we wrap up, we'll explore the impact on land, how entire neighborhoods were flattened, how hospitals struggled to keep up with the wounded, and how the government began the long and painful process of recovering from one of the worst typhoons in Hong Kong's history. In the aftermath of the typhoon, the people of Hong Kong faced a long road to recovery. In the weeks that followed, efforts to clear debris and restore order were carried out mostly by hand, using basic tools. Communication lines had been knocked out, and it took days before messages could be sent to nearby cities for assistance. Supplies were slow to arrive. What little help did come had to be delivered by sea, as many roads were blocked or destroyed. The colonial government conducted an inquiry to understand how the storm had caused so much damage and loss of life. Reports from that time revealed not only the limits of existing infrastructure, but also how ill-prepared the region was for a storm of that strength. The storm pushed the city to think more seriously about long-term planning. In the years that followed, improvements were made to breakwaters and harbor facilities. More attention was given to weather observation, and the typhoon warning system was gradually expanded. But for the people who lived through it, the typhoon left a permanent scar. Many survivors lost their homes, their families, or their livelihoods. For fishermen and harbor workers in particular, the disaster was devastating. Some left the region entirely, while others stayed and rebuilt, one wall at a time. The 1906 Hong Kong Typhoon is still remembered today as one of the deadliest natural disasters in the city's history. It highlighted the need for better preparedness, better infrastructure, and better understanding of nature's power. While the city has grown into a modern metropolis over the past century, the memory of that storm remains a reminder that Even the most advanced societies are never fully in control when it comes to the force of nature. In September of 1959, one of the most devastating natural disasters in Japanese history struck the nation, Typhoon Vera. It would go on to become the deadliest typhoon to ever hit Japan, leaving behind a path of destruction that would change the lives of millions. The typhoon's powerful winds, which reached speeds of up to 160 miles per hour, and relentless rainfall wreaked havoc on communities, infrastructure, and families across the country. It made landfall on September 26th, with its fury felt most intensely in the central and western regions of Japan. Typhoon Vera began its journey in the western Pacific Ocean on September 20th. It started as a low-pressure system, a common precursor to typhoons, but rapidly strengthened, gaining intensity as it moved toward Japan. The storm's trajectory was almost perfectly aligned to bring it over Japan's main islands. The warm waters of the Pacific Ocean fed the storm, making it grow even stronger as it neared land. By the time it hit Japan, it was already classified as a super typhoon, a term used for storms with sustained winds over 150 miles per hour. The typhoon's impact was felt across a vast area. One of the hardest hit regions was the city of Nagoya, which was submerged by the immense storm surge. The water flooded entire neighborhoods, leaving residents trapped in their homes with no way to escape the rising floodwaters. Along with the storm surge, the relentless rainfall caused rivers to overflow, leading to widespread flooding in towns and villages. As the typhoon roared through, the power was knocked out in many areas, and communication lines were cut off, making rescue efforts even more difficult. The destruction was widespread. Entire communities were decimated, with thousands of homes washed away by the floodwaters or destroyed by the ferocious winds. The physical toll was catastrophic, but the emotional and psychological impact was just as severe. Many people were forced to flee their homes, abandoning everything they had. In some cases, families were separated, unsure if they would ever see their loved ones again. As the storm raged on, the people of Japan found themselves at the mercy of nature's fury. Typhoon Vera's aftermath was nothing short of catastrophic. The official death toll would eventually rise to over 5,000, and many more were injured. The storm left millions of people homeless, displaced by the widespread destruction. Beyond the physical damage to homes and buildings, the typhoon also devastated Japan's economy. With so many industries impacted, people found themselves without jobs and livelihoods, and the country faced a long and difficult recovery process. It would take years for the country to rebuild, and the emotional scars left by the disaster would linger long after the physical damage was repaired. In the immediate aftermath of the typhoon, the Japanese government and emergency services faced immense challenges. The storm's power had left many areas completely inaccessible, and it was days before emergency workers could reach the worst-hit regions. The scale of the disaster was overwhelming, and at first there was little anyone could do to help. People relied on each other for survival, with neighbors coming together to help those in need. Despite the challenges, the resilience of the Japanese people began to shine through as they started the slow and painful process of recovery. Typhoon Vera's legacy would have a profound impact on Japan. It led to changes in disaster preparedness and response, with the government implementing more robust early warning systems and evacuation protocols. While the storm brought unspeakable tragedy, it also shaped the way Japan would handle future natural disasters. The lessons learned from Typhoon Vera continue to influence how the nation prepares for typhoons and other natural events today. The moment Typhoon Vera made landfall on September 26, 1959, it was clear that this storm would leave a mark on history. With winds roaring at over 160 miles per hour and relentless rains, the impact was felt almost immediately. The typhoon's arrival was terrifying, as it came ashore with a force rarely seen in Japan's history. The combination of the high winds and torrential rainfall created a deadly scenario, with homes, roads, and entire towns being wiped away in a matter of hours. In the days leading up to the typhoon's arrival, the government had issued warnings and urged people to evacuate coastal areas, but the scale of the disaster was far beyond what anyone had anticipated. As the storm slammed into Japan's central and western regions, the damage was not just from the winds, but also from the storm surge, which caused flooding in areas that were not even directly hit by the typhoon's winds. The surge brought massive waves that inundated towns along the coast, sweeping away anything in its path. Entire neighborhoods were submerged, and the floodwaters rose quickly, making it difficult for anyone to escape. One of the most shocking consequences of Typhoon Vera was the disruption of Japan's infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and railways were destroyed, leaving many people stranded in places that were difficult or impossible to reach. In some areas, the floodwaters were so deep that they cut off entire communities, leaving people without access to food, water, or medical care. The loss of power across vast areas meant that communications were cut off, making it nearly impossible for rescue teams to coordinate. For those in affected regions, the isolation was a terrifying experience, with no idea when help would arrive. The survivors of Typhoon Vera were left with unimaginable challenges. Many people had lost everything: homes, possessions, and in some cases, loved ones. The typhoon had torn apart the very fabric of communities, and the survivors faced the difficult task of rebuilding not only their homes, but their lives. The sense of loss was overwhelming, and many were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. For those who had escaped the worst of the storm, the trauma of what they had witnessed was something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. In the aftermath, the damage was so extensive that Japan struggled to assess the full extent of the destruction. In some regions, it would take days, even weeks, before the true impact of the storm became clear. The country was forced to rely on whatever resources were available to begin recovery efforts. Emergency shelters were set up and relief teams worked tirelessly to provide food, water, and medical assistance. Despite these efforts, the scale of the devastation meant that it would take months, if not years, for the country to fully recover. Japan's government would later face intense scrutiny over its preparedness for such a massive disaster, but in the immediate aftermath, the focus was on survival and recovery. As Japan began the slow process of rebuilding, the emotional scars of Typhoon Vera remained. Survivors often spoke of the horror they had experienced, from the deafening winds to the terror of watching their homes be destroyed by floodwaters. The stories of loss and survival were heartbreaking, and many felt that their lives would never be the same. Yet through all the devastation, there was also a sense of hope. The people of Japan came together to help one another, showing incredible resilience in the face of disaster. It was this strength and determination that would help Japan rise from the ashes of Typhoon Vera and begin the long process of recovery. The lessons learned from Typhoon Vera would go on to shape Japan's disaster preparedness strategy for years to come. While the nation would never forget the horror of that day, the tragedy would also push for advancements in forecasting, evacuation protocols, and response systems. Typhoon Vera's legacy was not just about the lives lost and the destruction left behind, but also about the changes it spurred in how Japan would face future natural disasters. As Typhoon Vera continued its devastating path across Japan, it left behind a trail of destruction that was hard to comprehend. The hardest hit areas were those in central Japan, where cities like Nagoya were caught in the full force of the storm. The damage was so severe that the city, once bustling and full of life, was reduced to a scene of chaos and despair. The floodwaters rose so high that they submerged buildings, streets, and entire neighborhoods. People trapped in their homes were forced to seek higher ground, many of them losing everything they had worked for. In the wake of the typhoon's fury, rescue efforts became an urgent priority. However, the damage to the infrastructure made it difficult for emergency services to reach the most affected areas. Roads were impassable, railways were down, and airports were rendered useless due to the widespread flooding and destruction. For many survivors, the first few days after the storm were marked by uncertainty and fear. They were isolated and cut off from the outside world with little hope of immediate help. One of the most heart-wrenching aspects of the aftermath was the sheer number of people who had lost their lives. The death toll, which eventually surpassed 5,000, was a grim reminder of the typhoon's destructive power. In addition to the loss of life, there was also the immense damage to property, which left millions homeless. Families who had once lived comfortably found themselves displaced and without shelter, while businesses were forced to shut down as they struggled to rebuild. Entire communities were left devastated, and the task of recovery seemed nearly impossible. The damage to agriculture was another significant consequence of the typhoon. Fields of crops, which were vital to the livelihoods of many rural communities, were washed away by the floodwaters. This loss of crops added to the already dire situation, as food shortages became a concern in many areas. With the infrastructure in ruins, transportation of supplies was slow, and many people were left without the essentials they needed to survive. The local economy, which had already been strained by the storm, faced even further setbacks as businesses struggled to get back on their feet. Despite the overwhelming challenges, the people of Japan did not give up. As the days passed and the waters receded, the survivors began to rebuild their homes and their lives. Volunteers from across the country arrived to help with the recovery efforts, providing food, water, and medical assistance to those in need. The government worked tirelessly to restore basic services like electricity and clean water, though it would take time for many areas to fully recover. The emotional toll on the survivors was also immense. Many had lost loved ones, and the trauma of witnessing such devastation was something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The stories of those who lived through the storm were filled with heartache and loss, but they also reflected the strength of the human spirit. People came together to support one another, offering whatever help they could to those in need. While the scars of Typhoon Vera would remain for years, the resilience and solidarity of the Japanese people became a beacon of hope in the face of tragedy. Typhoon Vera also marked a turning point in Japan's approach to disaster management. The scale of the destruction revealed the vulnerabilities in the country's infrastructure and emergency response systems. It was clear that more needed to be done to prepare for such devastating events in the future. The government, alongside experts in meteorology and disaster management, began to focus on improving early warning systems, enhancing evacuation plans, and strengthening the infrastructure to withstand future storms. These lessons learned from the tragedy of Typhoon Vera would go on to save countless lives in the years to come. The recovery process from Typhoon Vera was long and difficult, but it laid the foundation for a stronger, more resilient Japan. The lessons learned from the disaster were not just about how to prepare for future storms, but also about the importance of community and the strength of people coming together in times of crisis. The impact of Typhoon Vera would be felt for decades, but its legacy also served as a reminder of the importance of preparedness, unity, and hope in the face of adversity. As the months passed and the initial shock of Typhoon Vera's destruction began to fade, Japan's recovery continued at a slow and painstaking pace. The immediate focus was on providing shelter, food, and medical care to the millions of people left homeless or displaced. Relief efforts were in full swing, with both the government and private organizations working tirelessly to deliver aid to those in need. Temporary shelters were set up in schools, community centers, and other public buildings where survivors could find safety and support. However, the real challenge lay in rebuilding homes, schools, and businesses that had been destroyed in the storm. The Japanese government took a central role in coordinating the recovery efforts, focusing on clearing debris, restoring essential infrastructure like water and power supplies, and rebuilding transportation networks. Roads and bridges that had been swept away by the floodwaters were rebuilt, and damaged railways were repaired to allow for the movement of goods and people. The recovery was far from easy, and many areas remained in ruins for weeks or even months after the typhoon had passed. Yet despite these difficulties, Japan showed a remarkable ability to rebound from such a catastrophic event. One of the most significant aspects of the post-Typhoon Vera recovery was the shift in Japan's approach to disaster preparedness and response. The scale of the devastation had exposed critical weaknesses in the country's ability to handle such disasters, particularly in the areas of early warning systems and emergency management. In the years following the typhoon, Japan implemented major changes to its disaster preparedness programs. New infrastructure was built to withstand the impact of future typhoons, and the government introduced more advanced weather monitoring systems to provide earlier warnings to residents in danger zones. These improvements were aimed at ensuring that future storms would not have the same devastating impact. The emotional toll on the survivors of Typhoon Vera also left a lasting mark on the nation. Many people carried the trauma of losing loved ones or witnessing the destruction of their communities. However, in the face of this pain, the strength and resilience of the Japanese people shone through. Community groups, local volunteers, and national organizations came together to support those who had lost everything, offering assistance in the form of food, clothing, and financial aid. The recovery was not only a physical one, but also an emotional one, as the country worked to heal from the scars of the typhoon. In the years following the disaster, the memory of Typhoon Vera continued to shape Japan's approach to disaster management. The lessons learned from the storm became a crucial part of the country's disaster response strategies, with an emphasis on preparedness, quick response, and community support. Typhoon Vera was no longer just a tragic event in history. It was a turning point that led to significant improvements in how Japan dealt with natural disasters. The legacy of Typhoon Vera is still felt today, with the country continuing to invest in disaster resilience and risk reduction. The importance of building stronger infrastructure, improving early warning systems, and fostering a culture of preparedness became clear. The lessons from the typhoon, while painful, were transformative, shaping the way Japan faces future challenges from nature's unpredictable force. As Japan looks to the future, the memory of Typhoon Vera serves as both a somber reminder of the devastation that natural disasters can bring and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The country's ability to recover and rebuild after such a catastrophic event is a story of hope and strength in the face of overwhelming adversity. Typhoon. Vera may have left behind a trail of destruction, but it also sparked a movement towards a more prepared and resilient Japan, where communities are better equipped to face the challenges of the future.